Hello, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz, President of the City University Graduate Center. Welcome to Women, a series of programs for and about us. I'm delighted that Assembly Member Deborah Glick of Manhattan is able to join us today. A graduate of Queens College, she's devoted a majority of her life to civil and public service, beginning with her college years. She's serving her 7th term in the Assembly, the first openly lesbian and gay member of the state legislature. She has been a leader in the legislative fight for all of our rights, and we'll talk about her work and the job that lies ahead, given a legislature that has been sluggish, to say the least. Welcome.
Thanks.
You grew up in New York?
I was born in the Bronx and grew up in Queens.
Now that's a desertion. And you went to Queens College?
Indeed.
Was it there that you decided you want to be in politics?
I never really made that decision. I wanted to be involved in issues and concerned about the world around me. My father was locally active in a civic association, and I think I did hand out some leaflets at his behest when I was a youngster. But it really was the anti-war movement, the first Earth Day, and the struggle over reproductive freedom that brought me to issues, and that's what I spent many of my years working on, not as a job, but after hours.
And how did you decide that you wanted to run for a seat in the legislature?
I really...
Had you had any elective office before?
No, and although I worked in campaigns, and I did get more involved in electoral politics after Reagan was elected, and really targeted again choice as a right that he wanted to eliminate. And so I realized that you can't just work on issues. People who make decisions are involved in the government, and if one wants to have an impact and see that one's issues are protected and advanced, that you have to be involved in electoral politics. So I got a little bit more involved and became president of a gay and lesbian democratic club. And somewhere in there, I, and along with some other folks, felt that we had never managed in New York City to elect an openly gay person, and we had made several attempts. I made a decision to run with the support and encouragement of other people, and we thought I might run and raise my name recognition, lose, and come back again. To my great surprise, taking on a 36-year incumbent, he decided not to run, and it was an open seat in a wild race, and I got elected.
And when you got to the legislature, what were your first impressions?
Well, I guess I was surprised by a few things. I knew that I would be perceived through the screen of certain stereotypes, and so I felt a great responsibility to comport myself in a certain fashion to counteract those stereotypes, but realized that I also had some stereotypical views of other people, and some of them lived up to those. And I guess I thought that I was amazed at how incredibly bright some of the people were who were there, that they could have chosen to do any number of things, but they were involved in public service. And I was also surprised at how demanding the life could be, and that there were some other people who maybe weren't as sharp as one would like, and yet they were the folks who their community sent to Albany. So it was an interesting mix. I was I think, privileged in many ways to be there when some of the members were incredibly good debaters. Many of those folks have either moved on to other positions or retired, to be replaced by other people with different skills. But I think that debating in general has, and oratory in general has suffered over the last decade.
Is that because of the individuals who happen to be in the positions, or is it because of the dynamics of this legislature?
Probably a little bit of both. I mean, I think that, you know, if you look at, sometimes I think the world is evolution in reverse. When I was growing up, Playhouse 90 was on TV, and now it's replaced by Survivor. So I think that there are, in many arenas, things that I find disturbing, and it's a sort of a general dumbing down of the culture. And we're part of that, and so in some instances, I think that the lack of regular debate sometimes disturbs me, but then we'll have a debate that makes me think twice about whether or not we don't have people who are skilled.
Talk a little bit about this legislature, which has been, the euphemistic word I used was sluggish, but in fact, a recent analysis across the country has suggested that this is one of the least effective legislatures of all the states, perhaps the most dysfunctional. Is that too harsh?
Well, you know, it's very hard to be sitting inside the institution and not feel that there's a certain amount of unjustified carping that takes place. I do think that there are, that the public doesn't realize that we have an enormously powerful executive, and where the legislature can have an impact in the budget, just the way the process works, we are less able with somebody unwilling to be in a negotiation. We are less able to force that issue. I think that the campaign for fiscal equity, which had to do with fair funding for, in this particular instance, city schools, but there actually are school districts in need around the state, is an example of how the governor dragged his heels and dragged the process through court appeals and, you know, to each level. Before the Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, said, no, you must do something, and then directed the legislature to address it. The governor was very slow to impanel a group to make recommendations. And I think that there is a paralysis that we see, not just in New York State, but in some other, maybe even in the country, over some issues, and it's about partisanship. And I think that the sluggishness, as you term it, or the dysfunction as others perceive it, really is a function of the last 10 or 12 years of increased partisanship. And in some ways, I think there is a determination on the part of conservative forces to specifically make partisanship and to disable government. They would like government, quote, to be smaller, but they actually want government to be disabled. And partisanship and rancor is a way of discouraging good people from getting involved, and it is a way of slowing the process, and it is a way of having the public turned off.
How much of what you're describing is the effect of sort of a random set of forces that have come together, as opposed to what you're suggesting that it is an organized strategy?
Well, I think the strategy developed. I think the happenstance is that New York State has some sharp divisions, philosophical, political divisions. The reality is in 14 years I've served under 3 different speakers. The governor has, New York State has always had a late budget for 20 years,
right,
as has the country. We have the shortest time period in which to produce a budget, and yet it's one of the largest and increasingly more complex budgets in the country. And that time frame is reduced, and you have to have partners. And the governor does not particularly believe that, has, I think, contempt for the legislature and doesn't want anybody to tell him how to run the state, and I think is envious of the president having both houses of the Congress, and he would like to have both houses of the legislature. And I think the Democratic-led Assembly is particularly in the sights of those who are more conservative, because we do. It's true, there is some obstruction, and we do stop bad things from happening, and sometimes that's the best you can do.
Some other people would say you stop good things from happening.
Sometimes that happens too.
But how much of this is a function of the personalities of the leadership? I mean, there are many states that have split houses and senates and governors that, have different points of view. In the end, they kind of seem to work together, whereas in New York, sometimes nothing seems to work together.
I think that over the last couple of years, we've had some, we've been able to reach across and work with the Senate and make some decisions, produce bipartisan budgets. The governor, I think, is very upset about that. And so I would see it as not even always the partisan politics, but rather this split between the executive and the legislature. And the legislature, for better or worse, speaks for the people. The governor makes independent decisions. And he would prefer the whole 3 men in the room to change to 1 man in a room, and it's him. That, I think, has generated some of the personal rancor. And I think there is animus, and I don't think that that's healthy and good.
But what would it take to change these dynamics, which seem to be increasingly antithetical to getting done what has to get done for the state?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I think that there is a real concern on the part of legislators that I talk with to try to address some of the issues that have been raised on the outside. But I will say that there are some recommendations that are very idealistic and naive and don't seem to be grounded in the kind of unintended consequences, the review of the unintended consequences to the extent that I would like to see it. So I think that we're going to have in our House a very clear review and approach. Now, there are things over the last several years that certainly we've done. I can't mail anything to my constituents, a newsletter or anything, within 60 days of an election. I think that's good. I think that's a healthy reform. Some of that is about the incumbent protection, and I think that's good. And but that's a House rule. That's an Assembly rule. It's not for the entire legislature. I think that kind of thing, looking at being responsive, ensuring that people can have other avenues of redress, are good and appropriate in terms of having more public hearings, more forums where things are discussed. But I do think that it also takes a certain amount of leadership from the executive, which has been, in my humble opinion, very short.
Let's take something like the Rockefeller drug laws, which the word infamous can now go before that as a descriptor. Everyone seems to be agreed at this point that those laws are applied in very inappropriate ways, that they have cost the state millions and millions of dollars of incarcerating people for offenses that could be dealt with on a much simpler level, community work, whatever. What has prevented the change in those laws for 2-3 years now, since everyone has come to the consensus that they really do need to be changed?
Well, I think that, my personal screen through which I see things leads me to believe that we do have to have real reform and not something that papers over and is a press release reform. And I think that's what's been offered, or that the governor's been willing to accept. The district attorneys are unwilling, as a group, to support increased judicial discretion. And without judicial discretion, there is no real reform. And for the district attorneys, they see the ability for them to make decisions as to what charges are presented, and whether or not it's their leverage in being able to threaten somebody with long jail sentences. And that's and there is also the reality that we have less crime, but we still have a lot of prisons. And in order to keep them populated, you have to, one, retain these harsh laws, and two, increase penalties for lesser offenses in order to maintain a prison population that is now part of the economic development of upstate. They have done nothing to improve the economy in upstate New York. This governor's failed on that, and this would be, I assume, this for him would be a tremendous threat to those communities. I personally believe that we could redirect dollars into the state university in those little towns and provide people an opportunity to work in higher education rather than work in the prison system. You need not just professors, you need food service people, you need maintenance workers, you need whatever. And in towns upstate where you have a college campus, whether it's public or private, you have an economic engine. And they just do not seem capable of retooling. But my feeling is whether your child is is in prison because of an offense, or is a correction officer, which is a good paying job with a pension, they're both in prison. Either way, your kid's spending their life in jail, which is dehumanizing for everyone.
So do you see any chance to get these laws changed?
I believe that we have that the public will is there, and I believe that the support for judicial review of sentences of people already incarcerated is key. Those are non-negotiable, and those are the sticking points. And so I don't think that compromise, although I think that you need compromise to make progress, I don't think you can compromise on the basic principles. And so it is, in my humble opinion, we need to see the district attorneys who I believe make some people nervous about supporting those kinds of changes. We need to see the district attorneys take their association take a different perspective. And it is very conservative former legislators who are out there saying this isn't, we thought this was the thing to do. We no longer believe that. John Dunn is one of those people. He's been very aggressive and very outspoken, and we need to support him in trying to convince those very conservative elements that seem to be the obstacle.
But not to belabor this, if one sets the bar at a certain level for this high, or I'm not playing, as it were, is there any possibility of lowering the bar to at least get some change and then work to get the other kinds of changes?
Well, I think that we, the Assembly did pass some Rockefeller drug law reform bills. We have gone back to say we would pass these with these other provisions eliminated. We've taken a step back, and we have not gotten an appropriate response. But you cannot, on the very basic, there are some really basic principles. It would be like saying, well, we're for gun control, except you could buy it at a gun show, and then we wouldn't want a background check. There are certain things that you can't trade off and still call it reform. And the very basic issues are that it has to address people who are currently in prison, and their cases have to be reviewed, and their sentences perhaps they've served more than what would be appropriate, and they would have to be released. And you have to provide in the future for judicial discretion. We have 3 branches of government for a reason.
Well, one can only hope that the upcoming legislative session can deal with it, because those laws have resulted in so much human misery, to say nothing about the cost.
There's no question about it, but I think that we need to have the support around the state from newspapers, editorial boards. We don't just do this alone. We are representatives of the people. And as elected officials, we should be held accountable. But we're not the only part of the public. There is the fourth estate, and we need to have newspapers support our position and provide information to the public. The media has been too homogenized and has a role to play in terms of making certain that that there's clarity for the public in what the issues are, because I think if it's laid before them clearly, they will be, and we have gotten, gun control is one of those issues where there was a drumbeat from the newspapers.
Talk a little bit about the Campaign for Fiscal Equity, the court order that said that the New York City schools are severely underfunded for the job they have to do, and that there has to be a revision of the state formulas for funding the New York City public schools. It's not happened. Why?
I think that the obstacle, well, first of all, the court order relates simply to New York City. There are probably several other locations around the state, some rural counties, that are similarly disadvantaged. And it would be most appropriate if we addressed the funding formula for the entire state and managed to address the issues for those districts as well. If we don't, we're just inviting lawsuits, which they will win, incidentally. So it would be most appropriate to do a comprehensive review. We haven't done it because there is this perception in the public that if the city of New York gets more money, they will get less. They have been getting more all along. The approach that I think we favor is to say, we're taking no money away from anyone because we don't want students in other districts to have less than what they've had. We would like the students in the districts that have had less to have what those students have. So we're not trying to take money away from them. But going forward, you cannot continue to have the same disparity. And so this notion that if they have gotten 12% of the budget for suburban communities, that they still must continue to get 12%, the same share, probably doesn't mathematically work out. So that is the stumbling point. And in so many areas, the split that is perceived as upstate, downstate is not that so much as urban and rural communities have many of the same problems, and the suburban communities have different problems. So that, in my view, is where the split exists, and the playing off of those communities is why we have the gridlock that we have.
Well, Deborah, we could talk a long time because there are a lot of issues in the legislature yet to be resolved. One can only wish that in this upcoming session, some of them will be resolved. But I'm sorry that we're out of time. My thanks to Assembly Member Deborah Glick for joining us. For the City University Graduate Center and Women to Women, I'm Frances Deegan Horowitz.